Alright, can anybody hear me? Let me know once you have audio and video. Okay, Sagrius has audio. Ham sensing, all good. Okay, let's wait about maybe 10-15 more seconds. Yeah, looks like Twitch is on. YouTube is still silent, so hopefully the folks at YouTube can also hear. But we'll wait a little bit. Okay, it seems like both Twitch and YouTube are on. I think we just have most people on Twitch, so I don't see anyone in the YouTube chat. But I think that this should be working. Marek, you can confirm YouTube's on, right? Should be on. Oh, it's off. You're saying YouTube's off. Really? Maybe try refresh on YouTube. That's kind of strange. It shouldn't be off. Let me double check my settings. Yeah, it should be on. Can you try refreshing, Marek? Or maybe it's taking a while to load, so we can wait a little bit. But I mean, I did turn it on. CCD saying not okay. It's on now. Yeah, okay. So it's just loading. Okay. Alright guys, let's go ahead and begin then. So welcome to our lesson today. My name is Karav Joshi. I'm the president of Chess University and one of your instructors in the Prodigy program. This is the 900 section, and our topic for today is important patterns you should know. We'll focus more on the smothered mate, maybe talk about back rank mates, but overall the focus will be some important patterns that you should know by end of the day. I don't know how many of you did the homework, but if you've done some homework, we recommended some reading assignments from Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, which also has some back rank patterns that you should know. So hopefully you got to that. If not, I hope you can do that in the next week or so. And okay, let's go ahead and start with smothered mates today. Stanger saying this is confusing. I received 2 emails. One said, I have no idea what emails you received. But the 900 is starting right now. If you look at the full schedule, the 1500 had the last class yesterday. Okay, so smothered mates. Well, one example I want to start with is in the Caro-Kann. And if we look at e4, c6, d4, d5, this is the main way to start a Caro-Kann opening. Knight to c3 is the classical variation. In this position, the most common move for black is d takes e4, knight takes e4. And here there are a couple of variations that black can try. Bishop f5 is the most common move, developing a bishop, hitting the knight with tempo. But there's also knight f6, which is pretty common. And even knight d7 is common. Knight d7 preparing knight f6 so that when white captures, the knight can recapture. And that's called the Karpov variation. So in this example, we'll look at knight d7, the Karpov variation. And there's an interesting trick here that I've tried sometimes in online games, blitz games and bullet games. And it's a pretty neat trick. It often works. And that move is queen to e2. Now after queen e2, what do you think black should play? What's white's idea behind this move, and how should black respond to queen e2? So did our queen e2 move contain a threat as white? Exactly, knight to d6, right? When knight d7 is played by black, his knight is blocking his king in as well. So the king doesn't have any physical squares he can move to. And if we're able to play knight d6, then that would be a check from the knight. But his pawn would not be able to take because the queen pins that pawn. And so what we see very often actually is a move like knight to f6 here. But then just knight d6 wins on the spot. So that's a classic smothered mate here in the opening. And the king is smothered in by his own pieces. And so what black should play would be a move like e6, right? Black should play a move like e6. That way, well, there's no smothered mate anymore. The bishop is open. And black can just go ahead and finish up development next. Moving the knight out, getting the bishop out, and getting castled. But people often don't realize the threat or don't even put the effort into finding the threat behind the queen e2 move. And that's why I've had many games, at least 10-15 games that I've won with this exact position, with knight d6 here. Now, cheap threats are not worth playing if they're not good if your opponent properly responds. So if against queen e2, if black were to play a natural move, like e6, and the resulting position is bad for white, well then I would not recommend it. But in this case it's okay. Queen e2, even though it's non-standard, even if black plays perfectly, this is perfectly okay for white as well. So let's quickly figure out how we would develop. Well, I think you have multiple options, but knight to f3 looks very easy here. Let's say black develops his knight. We would probably trade off some knights here. And because the queen is on e2 and blocking our bishop, I might make another move here to prepare proper development. What move might that be, do you think? Queen e2 is non-standard, right? Normally you would play, a move like bishop d3 and get castled, but it doesn't make sense to think in that way here because you've got a queen sitting on e2. Yeah, MT says g3. That's perfectly correct. You would play g3, you would put the bishop on g2, and get castled. And so your position is perfectly okay in the queen e2 variation. It's not like you're hoping that a cheap threat works out. If it works out, that perfectly, that's good for us, right? We're very happy if we get a checkmate on move 5. But even if our opponent sees it, the resulting continuation is still good. So sometimes I try it against the Karpov variation, especially in the speed chess time controls, like 3 minute per person, 5 minute per person, and so on. Okay, let's look at our next example then. And let's flip the board, look at an opening for black. After d4, knight to f6, c4, there's a complicated, sharp opening called the Budapest gambit, which starts with the move e5. The Budapest gambit is not the most recommended opening as black. I mean, it's borderline dubious, but it's also playable. I've played it maybe twice over the board. Normally I play a sensible opening, but so sometimes it's fun to play the Budapest as well. It's not horrible. And there's one pattern that I really like in this opening, which I want to show you. After d takes e5, the point is that black plays knight g4. So we've lost a pawn, right? It's called a gambit because, we are losing a pawn here. Once he takes, we go knight g4. The idea is to recapture this pawn, which he does not want us to do. And therefore, he would defend it. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. We continue building pressure on the pawn that we want to recapture. And bishop f4 is also a common move to keep defending that pawn. After bishop b4 check and knight bd2, what would you say is black's best move? So I'll give you a minute to think about it. What would you say is black's best move after knight b to d2? Okay, we see a vote for f6, queen e7. Alright guys, speak up. We have more students in here. What do you guys think? After knight bd2, what would you play as black? Okay, d6 mentioned in the chat. Couple more seconds. Anybody else want to take a guess? Empty. I think there's a smothered mate in there somewhere. Maybe. Jeremiah saying d6. Okay. In this, so d6 is a pretty good move. I think it's not bad. But the best move is queen e7. So queen e7 adds one more attacker on this pawn. So now we have both knights and the queen. 3 attackers. And white has 2 defenders. Now, suppose he plays a move like a3, which is, I would say, somewhat common here. I don't know if it's the most common move or not in this position, but if not the most, it's the second most common move. Attacking our bishop. So my question for you then is, how does black play in this position? After a3, our bishop is now hanging. What do you do with the bishop? Or do you ignore the threat? Yeah, so the point is, because of these tactical ideas, such as the smothered mate concept, you can actually ignore the threat on your bishop. See, whenever your piece is attacked and your piece is hanging, you need to first determine if that threat is real or not, right? Is it a real threat, or is it just an artificial threat? And you don't know that until you analyze your own forcing moves in response to the move that was just played. So a3 is a forcing move from white, attacking our bishop. But that doesn't mean that we're forced to respond. We may have our own forcing move that's even stronger. And in this position we do. You can play the move knight from g takes e5. Just taking a pawn. You have 3 attackers. He had 2 defenders. Take the pawn. But of course, we would be wondering, well, why can't he just take our bishop? Don't we just drop a piece? Well, no, because now you notice this is similar to that previous example, where if you look at your forcing moves, your checks, captures, and threats that are available to you, you might notice there is this move, knight to d3. And so if you were to take your bishop, well, you would now play knight to d3 and you would win the game. Therefore, your bishop is actually safe. He cannot take your bishop. He would lose the game if he did that. And that's why you can easily go ahead and recapture the pawn here. After knight takes e5, maybe he should play, I think e6 is okay, or he could just take the knight, and then, e3, and then play e3. Something like this is reasonable for him. And now I guess you can go ahead and take. But you regain your pawn, and the position's roughly equal. So black's doing pretty good in this variation of the Budapest, for example. Okay? No, black is not losing any material. We can count. So initially we were down 1 pawn, right? E5 and d takes e had happened at the very beginning. That pawn is now regained when we do knight on g takes e5. But he cannot take the hanging bishop because of mate. And if he takes our knight and we recapture, he still cannot take the hanging bishop because of mate. If he were to take our knight, thinking that if we take the bishop, then he takes our bishop, what's the flaw in that logic? What would you play as black if white did bishop takes e5? Yeah, you would just play bishop d2 first, right? In between forcing move. 2, and you got a pretty much equal position as black. White has no advantage in such a position. It's completely equal. So yeah, I mean this variation works out very well in the Budapest. Squiggle is asking, why do you consider it borderline dubious? Well, that's the overall opinion of the opening, but the thing is that there are certain variations that are not completely worked out yet, that seem to cause some problems for black. And I think one of them might be knight c3 here instead of knight bd2. I'm not too up to date on the Budapest theory these days. I don't play it anymore. But there are some lines where it seems like white still has some decent advantage. But again, it's not an opening that's been completely resolved yet. So there are folks who enjoy it. There are folks who think it's dubious. I think the overall fact is that it's somewhere in between. I think it's close to playable. This is the 900 section. Yeah. L501 saying sacrificing pawn centers in the opening. Isn't that a bad idea? Normally it is. Yeah. But in this case you regain the pawn. I mean, black controls the center okay in this line. But our focus for today is not opening principles. The focus is just some patterns you should be able to see quickly. And that's why we show this position. So I'm not recommending the Budapest by any means. But if you were to have these types of positions, you should be able to find that smothered mate resource. Okay. And here is our next position. In this position, it is white to move. And my first task for you is not to mention any moves just yet, but just think about the position, look at what's going on, count the material. What do you think is the evaluation of this position? Is white better or black better? What is the evaluation of the current position? Who is better? Yes, I mean, if we count the material, black has 2 rooks. Both are worth 5 points, so that's 10 points in rook material, and 3 pawns. So 13 points of material for black. And if we count for white, well, the bishop and the knight are both 3. So combined value is 6 points, plus 4 pawns, so 10 points. So we have 10 points of material, black has 13. That's a good starting point, right? But then the next step is, okay, what about the position? You don't know anything about any chess position until you look at the forcing moves available in that position for both sides. So white is down material, we know that. But does white have a forcing move that might change things up a little bit? There was a good comment in the chat, which was that black is up in material, but white's position is better. Yeah, so if you look at the position, there are a couple interesting things here. One is that the king over here is stuck, so it could possibly be smothered, right? This rook is inactive. This rook is centralized, but not really doing anything. The pawn and the bishop are very good there. The rook doesn't actually have many squares to go to. I mean, he could try attacking the g-pawn. That doesn't do anything. The rook is kind of suspicious as well. If we play the move knight b5, which is a forcing move that attacks the rook, you might also notice that we're attacking the c7 square. So it's a double attack, right? You have a simple double attack here where, because black's position is not so good here, because his king is weak, his rook is passive and making the king trapped, and this other rook also being on a vulnerable square, you can play knight b5 and use the smothered mate threat to win a free rook, right? Sep saying no sound. There should be sound. Okay, so after knight to b5, I mean, black just has to move this rook. Otherwise, he's getting mated. There's no way for black to solve both problems in one turn, right? So he would play just, rook h8, for example. Rook h8. And now it is white who is up significant material. Now black has 8 points. We still have 10. And the connected passed pawns will pretty much win the game for us. Okay? Alright, next position. I'll give you about, let's say, 1 minute to think about it. It is white to move in this position. Can you spot some tactical ideas? What would you say is the best move for white? And I'll give you a minute to think about it. Very good. So I see knight f7 and queen g8 in the chat. Both moves work. Knight f7 is the classic smothered mate pattern, right? If you play knight to f7, if you play knight f7 here, king g8, well, now you can give a double check with knight to h6, and a double check is easiest to analyze because your opponent is forced to physically move the king. You cannot block a double check or take a piece that's giving a double check, because there are two pieces doing that. The check comes from two different directions, and therefore the king must physically move. And h8 is the only square. But okay, you can now go queen g8. Did the board freeze up again on me? Let's see. Okay, you can go queen g8. Rook takes, and then knight to f7 delivers mate. Like so. But the thing is, in the initial position, you don't even have to play knight f7. You could actually just play queen g8. Right? Queen g8 just wins immediately. His king cannot take, because our bishop covers the queen. Therefore, the rook must take, and now knight to f7 is made. So this is just one step further from what we looked at in the previous position, right? In the previous position, we just wanted to go to c7 and win the game. Well, that was convenient because the rook was already on b8, blocking his king, suffocating the king. In this position, that wasn't the case. The rook was a little bit away, right? We had to first get the rook to be right next to the king. That way the king has nowhere to go. And that's what a move like queen to g8 accomplishes. And let's look at the next position. This is actually from a game that Marek played, our favorite moderator in the chat. And I'll skip ahead to the moment where the pattern was visible. I think it was around here. Yeah, and so after castling, queen d4 was played here, bishop d2, and black played rook to e8. Okay, and can you guys quickly spot the best move here for white? Why is rook e8 incorrect? Yep, it's again a classic smothered mate. This time you need all four moves. Knight to f6, knight to f7 check, king g8, knight h6, king h8, queen g8, and it doesn't matter which way he takes, rook or knight. Either way, we have knight f7 next. So in smothered mates, you can see that one important pattern is that the square that's a knight's move away from the king is unprotected by the opponent. So in all these examples, we're able to easily occupy that square and deliver checkmate. This pattern sometimes does not work. Well, always doesn't work if that square is properly covered, I think. Unless if you have the other knight's move away from the king square or some other tactical pattern. But I've seen some smothered mate fails where people attempt this knight f7 check and so on, this pattern, but it doesn't work because there's some other piece that's ultimately guarding the f7 square in that final position where they're trying to deliver the mate. Right, and queen g8 instantly would not have any protection here. Yeah. Okay. Next position then. So black just played the move king to b8 here, and it is now white to move. What would you say is white's best move? Very good, Teolite. Yep, it's a Morphe game. Indeed. It's Morphe's game from one of the events in Paris. About, I think it was 1859. Long time ago. And Morphe played the move knight d7 check. After which king c8 is the only possible move. And then what? What's the follow-up? We're now applying the same pattern, just at a different location of the board, right? After knight d7, now what? Right. I mean, multiple moves work here, I think. Knight e5 check works. But knight b6 is the most straightforward. Again, the key idea is a double check. You get a check from the knight and the queen, which means that the king must physically walk. And if he plays king to d8, well, in that case, he would just checkmate on d7. Therefore, he has to play king b8. But now we apply the same pattern where we sacrifice the queen. Yep, like Manum said, queen to c8. Yeah, he said b8, but you mean queen c8. Yep. Queen to c8. Rook takes c8. And knight d7 would be game over. And that's how this Morphe game ended. Next position. What would you say is white's best move in this position? It is white to move. And how should you play? Does the smothered mate work? Or does it not work in this position? Okay, so if knight c7 check, king b8, then what? So knight c7 check, king b8, and then okay, so there's some uncertainty in the chat. Queen is guarding the square apparently. Okay. But regardless, what do you play? If suppose that knight to c7 is played, then king b8, do you then give a double check? Or no double check? So let's say you give a double check and he goes back. Then what? So Mario's saying then queen b8, then smothered. So to recap what you're saying, we're looking at knight to c7 check, king b8, knight a6 double check, king back to a8. Then you're saying queen to b8 check, forcing rook takes b8. But then if you try to deliver the smothered mate with knight c7, it does not work. Let me show you. Knight c7. This happened in one of these student games from last year. King b8. Knight to a6 check. King a8. Queen b8. Rook takes. Knight c7. And that was an epic fail. It does not work. The square is guarded by the queen. So whenever you analyze the pattern, of course you're getting a hang of the pattern, but spend some time visualizing the final position. Make sure that you can actually deliver that mate at the end. Otherwise you might end up blundering. Okay, and yeah, it's pretty common. I've seen this many times. The Dreamland saying I did the mistake in a tournament game was embarrassing, lol. That's the way that goes, pretty much. I mean, so you have to see the patterns, know the typical ideas, but also when it does not work. And that way you can identify which case it is. I mean, usually it does work. The smothered mate pattern is pretty typical, but, there are cases where it doesn't. Probably saying, could queen take knight at first move? No. Because then white's just winning. If he takes the knight here, white's just winning now because white's up a queen. Right? Well, let's go back then. How do we play this position in reality? So knight c7 check is still good. Forget the smothered mate. It's still a forcing move. It's a check. It's getting black's king under a discovered attack. I mean, you still have strong tactical ideas, maybe. The smothered mate itself does not work. But you might still have some other move here. So think about it. Knight to a6 does not work, right? Knight to a6, I mean, you can play it, but after king a8, you have to go back. I mean, you have to go back and then pick a different move. Otherwise, you're blundering. So, after king b8, you can play the move knight to b5 check. That would be the best move, I would think. And after king a8, maybe you can play the move h3, attacking the knight. Knight maybe goes back to f6. Where does the knight go? Whoops. I mean, knight h6 looks pretty sad. Suppose he plays knight to f6 here. Well, now I think I'm winning. Can you tell me why? This position looks winning to me. Looking at this variation now, where we played knight c7, king b8, knight b5 check, king a8, h3 attacking this knight, knight goes back, and now I think we're winning. Why is that? What's the difference? Okay, yep, now we're seeing good comments in the chat. So if you play knight c7 here, and king to b8 happens, okay, you don't have a smothered mate still, but that's okay. That's not the end of the world for you. You still pick up a free knight. You can now play knight d5, or knight e8, and you pick up a free knight, so you're winning. Right? And it's not like black could have prevented this, because after h3, where does the knight go? I mean, the knight's hanging. The knight can't go anywhere. He could try this, knight to h6, I guess, but that just looks wrong. How do we win in this position? Well, let's try knight c7 again. Let's see, knight c7. And what about knight e8 check? Yeah, this looks pretty strong, I think. And suppose that king plays... Well, if he goes king to c8, my queen comes in with check, so I think the king would probably just go back. And after king to a8, we should be able to figure out a win. Starting with a move like queen e5, I would say. And, you know, we're coming for him. He might create a square for his king. But okay, I'm going to play rook d1. And my knight has a very good blockade against his rook. My queen is very well centralized. All of his pieces are useless. Rook is coming in. I think that black can resign. Okay. So black was in trouble had white played in that manner. And yeah, there was a question in the chat. I think Ryan already answered this. But after h3, black cannot take the pawn. If he takes a pawn, well, now the queen no longer defends the c7 square. So we're back to the classic smothered mate. Okay. Alright, next position then. Okay, here we have a very similar position. Well, some pieces have been moved around a little bit, but this is probably an artificial position I made. That's an extraction from the previous one. So here we have white to move, and the question for you here is, what do you think is the best move? What would you play as white? Okay, we see knight c7 in the chat. We see h3 again. We see rook d1. Okay. Anybody else want to comment? What else is available here? Yeah, very good. Yeah, Dreveland saying rook d1 or e1. So, in this position, what's different is that black's back rank is not covered, and the king has no room to breathe. There's no rook that smothers him here, and I think knight c7 does work, but even if it didn't, the point is that you have this back rank that is so weak. He has this square defended by the queen, but the back rank is completely open. So sometimes what's easiest is just look at the back rank mating threats. Just play rook d1. How does he stop mate? If you threaten to go rook to d8, that's a one move threat. Is there any way he can defend it? Looks pretty tough. How do you defend that? Suppose he plays queen e7, queen stopping rook d1. But now you can just play knight c7 check, and black is busted. If you were to move the king, you have knight to a6, and there is no queen sacrifice on the back rank. It's just a mate, right? It's just a mate on the back rank using your queen. But otherwise, his only move is to sacrifice. Whoops. After knight to c7, the only other move. My board just froze. Okay, rook d1. Okay, queen e7, there we go. Knight c7. The only other move is to sacrifice. And in that case, well, we have mate in probably 2 turns. And besides that, we're up a queen. So, easily winning, right? So always make sure that you look out for back rank mates. Back rank threats, along with smothered threats, go very well together. It's often hard to accommodate both threats for your opponent. Okay, let's look at the next position then. White to move. We had a student who actually got a draw from this position, which was kind of disappointing. What is the best move for white in this position? JF doesn't. Yeah, you could play knight to c7 check first, and I think you would be able to win the queen anyway. So the previous position had many winning moves. But the rook move was the fastest mate. Yep, very good. So this comes down to analyzing forcing moves again here. What the student played in the game was rook to d1. Rook d1 with the idea of doubling up rooks, threatening a back rank checkmate. Well, what's funny is that what he was preparing already existed. If he looks at forcing moves, checks, captures, and threats, all he has to do is take the rook on a1. After he takes on a1, and black takes back, well, the back rank is completely open. So the simple winning continuation would be just rook trade, and mate next turn. But rook d1 was played by the student. So again, just be sure to analyze your forcing moves. You can often find easy victories if you do that. And now let's move on to a more difficult example. In this position, let's see, I forgot where this pawn was, but basically white just took on c5 and is attacking both the rook and the queen. And the queen's also tied down to defending the bishop. And we're going to approach this position as black. So it is black to play here. I'll give you a minute to think about it. What would you say is the best move for black? And I'll give you a hint. Make sure you think about the back rank as well. Potential back rank threats down the road. In this position, what would you play as black? Drillland is saying, which rating class does there exist in the course? Well, this lesson right now is for the 900s, so you're actually rated twice the target level here. But in the Prodigy program, we have the 900 section, the 1200, the 1500, and the 1750. So our highest regular section is 1750 plus ELO. Okay, so queen takes c5 is in the chat. So if you play queen takes c5, doesn't your bishop just hang? What do you play after queen takes c5 and rook takes e5? Didn't black just drop the bishop? What would you play as black if white takes your bishop? Okay, you're saying queen takes f2. Interesting. Let's take a look. Suppose we play queen takes c7, queen takes c5, taking this pawn, which is attacking our queen and our rook. But our queen no longer covers the bishop, and so it seems like the bishop just falls. But now you're saying we can play them if queen takes f2 check. Okay, so if queen takes f2 check, the queen is powerful, and he can play king h1, and I mean there's potential here. But then the question is, what do you do next? What is the continuation from here? You won the pawn, your queen and rook are doubled up, but you've lost the bishop, and now the question is, do you have a direct continuation or not? So what would be the continuation for black? Or is it a dead end? Did we just goof up? Okay, so rook b2 is mentioned in the chat. Rook b2 is playable. Looks like a pretty strong move here. You have a threat against g2. I think white would play queen takes g7, and then we can simply play rook f7. And white would be forced to sacrifice the queen here. Queen takes f7, queen takes f7, and now he goes back rook e1 to try to defend. Yeah, so I mean, after rook b2, you're up material, you got the queen. You're winning, of course, pretty easily. But you do have a better move than rook b2. Rook b2 works, but it's not the best move. Can anyone find an improvement? Okay, now we're seeing lots of rook b1 checks in the chat. We see queen c1 check. Okay. Queen d4 also mentioned. Well, okay. I haven't looked at queen. What was the solution? Queen c1 check. C1's over there. Did you mean queen f1 check? Queen f1 check itself just hangs the queen. He does have two pieces covering that square. So we just hang material if we do that. But I do like the rook b1 suggestion. So let's go back and take a look at that. Did the board freeze up on me again? Come on. Okay. So if you go back here, and instead of queen to f1, what about rook to b1? Let's think about that for a moment. Rook b1 is a move you should analyze. And why should you analyze it? Why should that move come up in your analysis? Well, it would be because it's a forcing move, right? Because it's a check. And you should always analyze your checks. And so if you play rook b1 check, well, analyze what your opponent has to do here. What are his options? Will he just take your rook? He could do that. But what's the drawback of him taking your rook? The drawback is that he has one less defender of f1. Exactly. It removes the defender. It distracts the defender, right? It's a deflection tactic. So after rook b1, bishop takes b1 was played in the game. And simply queen f1. And that's back rank mate. Queen f1. Knight takes. And rook takes f1. The question in the chat was about, let's see, there was an earlier queen c1 after queen takes c5. Okay, we can take a look. Okay, so you're saying after queen takes c5 and rook takes bishop. What about queen to c1 in this position? That was the question. I think that just bishop f1. But there's no continuation from here, I don't think. You have to be pretty forcing. If you're not forcing, remember that there's a queen and a rook very close to your own king. So if you play a bit too casually here, well, I think maybe now you're losing, right? So we have to be careful. We have to be very forcing. Queen c1 itself is a forcing move, but it doesn't have a continuation. So queen f2 check is fine, but you can also play rook b1 here. Rook b1 check, also playable. And after he takes, queen f2, same thing as before, just a different move order. Okay. Okay, we have a couple of minutes, so we can do one more example. And let me skip ahead in this example because we don't have too much time. Let's take a look at this position. Okay, so this position is extremely complicated, first of all. In the 1500 section, we spent 90 minutes studying this position. It's actually the first lesson in the 1500 curriculum, spending 90 minutes on this position. But the point is that there are certain continuations from this position, which we can use as an example for today. So in this, I'll skip ahead a little bit. After knight g5, and I was white in this position, the move that was played by black is knight takes c1. And knight takes c1 grabs a full rook, right? White just lost a rook. Okay, so we're down a rook after knight takes c1. And the question is now what? So can you guys identify what I was maybe thinking here after he takes my rook? What was the idea? What should white play after knight takes c1? Yep, queen to h7 check is correct. So we win a pawn, the queen enters the position, and his king steps aside. And ideally, we want to checkmate him, right? We lost a full rook on c1. This can't be good, unless if we're winning immediately. So what we want to do here is, see if we can do some kind of a back rank mate, for example, or any kind of mate. Just try to checkmate this king in whatever way we can. Now, if you want to try a back rank checkmate, well, you could then consider a move like rook takes e6 maybe. Take a look at this move for a moment. If you play rook takes e6, that move threatens back rank mate, right? Right now you don't have back rank mate. If you play queen to h8, that's not a back rank checkmate because the king can just walk away. So if we do want a back rank mate, we need to first cut off the king. So rook takes e6 might be an idea, where we're sacrificing a rook to cut off the king. And we know that he must take, when we're calculating, we know that he must take the rook because his own attempt to back rank checkmate us does not work. Our rook covers the e1 square. And if he plays any other move, we do have a back rank checkmate. But then the question is, okay, what if he just takes our rook then? So we know that because of the back rank mate threat, we know what he has to play. We can simplify the calculation significantly, right? Down to a single variation. But then the question is, okay, if you want to do rook takes e6, what happens if he takes? You're now down 2 rooks. Is that okay? Or is that bad? Is that a misapplication of trying to get a back rank mate? Or is it a correct application if you were to play rook takes e6 here? So who is in favor of rook takes e6 and who is against it in this position? Okay, let's analyze it. So suppose rook takes e6, f takes e6. I see queen f5 in the chat, but I'm not sure what that means. The pawn does cover f5. Okay, VEPN is in favor. Gingergram saying go for it. Okay, almost a 50-50 split. It's like Morfinsky said, well, calculate to mate if possible. Do you have mate here or not? It's one or the other, right? I mentioned, I noticed in the chat that someone said we could fork the rook and the king. Well, what value does that have? You're down 2 rooks, right? You're down 2 rooks. If you deliver a fork and win 1 rook for the knight, what value does that have? Not to mention the fact that back rank mate is threatened against you. So one thing to do when you're attacking, of course, is make sure that your own king is not collapsing either, right? So either you find a checkmate or you should not play this way. You need to have a forced mate. So can you guys see it? Is there a forced mate, or is it just a blunder for white? What do you guys think? Okay, Dreveland, the 1750 in the class, you should be able to figure this out. So it turns out there is a checkmate. You played the move Queen H8 check, forcing King E7. It's the only move. You now play Queen takes G7 check, attacking the king with check, and he has two moves. He can play King D6 or King E8. Well, King E8 is just a checkmate with Queen to F7. Or he could go King to D6. And depending on what's easier to calculate, you may notice either Knight E4 check or Queen E5 check. Both are okay. Queen E5 check is the same pattern as before, where you actually push the king back. And if he goes to D7, you have mate next turn on E6. If he goes to E7, well, same thing. And then mate on F7. But you have a one move faster checkmate if you see it here, which is Knight to E4 check, King to D5, and Queen E5 mate. What's interesting in this position is that whether black took the rook or the knight, both are hanging, by the way. I had a crazy position here where my knight is hanging and my rook's also hanging. But what's funny is that he can't take either of them for the same reason. We saw there was a forced mate in 6 if he took the rook, right? If he takes the knight, there's still a mate in 6, which is fascinating. In this position, you can still play Queen H7 check, King F8, Rook takes E6, threatening back rank mate, which forces him to take. And this position is so spectacular that my board froze again. Come on. Okay, just waiting for the board to behave. Surprising that Fritz is not behaving. Come on. There we go. So after Rook takes E6, F takes E6, you can now play Queen to H8, King to E7, Queen takes G7, and the same king walk happens as before, right? But the point is that you're still winning because this king is still cut off. The king still has to go to D5, basically. That's the problem. If you play Knight E4 check, the king still has to go there, allowing you to deliver mate on D5. You probably have mates in some other ways. You could do Queen takes C7 and Queen E5. That's also a mate. So what's funny is that if you have the rook, black is cut off on the C file, right? The rook controls the whole C file, so black has no escape. But even if you don't have the rook, well, in that case, this knight on the rim and this pawn combined is equivalent to a rook, right? They cover these 3 squares, which is what you need. So either you have the actual rook on C1, or your knight and pawn form that rook type of effect, which again keeps the king blockaded. No, my opponent did not see that whole line. He died. He got crushed. he got mated. In the actual game, he took on C1. He took on C1, and the game ended. Oh, well, not this one. Where's the other line? Yeah, he took here. And the game actually ended with this position here. And I think he resigned maybe like one move before the mate happened. Okay? Alright guys, so that wraps up our lesson today. The goal for today was to again look at important checkmating patterns. Smothered mate, back rank mate, and some other just checkmating patterns you should know. It's often the case that the checkmate pattern you're trying to achieve does not happen, does not work. But just because of that threat, just because of the possibility of that smothered mate or back rank mate, your opponent is forced to make inferior moves and give you better positions. So whenever you calculate, be sure to look at your forcing resources, especially those that involve any kind of mating attack, because those threats allow you to get away with better moves. Okay? Alright, that's it for this lesson for the 900s. Up next, in about 22 minutes here, is the conclusion for the Prodigy program in July. So that'll be the last live session for July, which all sections should attend together. And we'll talk about some remaining updates for this month, and then plans for next month. Okay? Alright guys, hope you enjoyed the lesson. See you in about 20 minutes. Bye.